I don't know whether some of you may regard yourselves as optimists or pessimists. I came across this little picture during the week in readiness for today. I hope you don't see this in bad taste, but it's only a little reminder that things can get worse. Obviously, some of you don't quite get it, but I'll not explain it if you can't get it. But actually, when we come to think, Lauren, you're obviously completely missed out there. Your face is just giving that completely away. Your dad will explain it to you when you get home. So things can always get worse. But when we come today and we're thinking about the resurrection, there are so many questions that people have about the resurrection because it's so different. It's so not like any of our experiences. And the question that really many people do have, of course, is they question, is this for real? Because this is not normal. Things like this don't normally happen. Are you seriously trying to tell me that you actually believe this stuff? And there's, of course, many people go out into the street. Many people will not believe this, and they'll wonder why you believe it. Even, amazingly, even within some churches, we can, of course, have people who doubt this. And today, I am going to try and look at the passage that we've read together, and hopefully, by looking at some of the things that Matthew writes, and he's writing almost innocently because Matthew is writing just things that he sees, and he's being honest and open, just what he sees, and he's writing it down. And as we then perhaps try and dig behind what he writes, that hopefully we will come and have reasons as to why we believe that we can be confident in actually believing that this resurrection is true and it's real. And so maybe I'm going to look at a few reasons. The first one is, and this is what I believe, and the reason that I believe the resurrection personally is that I read what Matthew writes, and I have an understanding that Matthew is an eyewitness of that. But what I'm saying initially here is that I think we can safely say that the tomb really was empty on that first resurrection Sunday. And of course we have to believe, and surprisingly that some people think that Jesus Christ was not a real person. Now, that's self-evidently so, and that there's more documentary evidence that Jesus lived than many Roman emperors and things like that. So Jesus was a real person. And what you can really say is that we know that the tomb was empty. And the reason that we can believe that is because there were conspiracy theories to say that the tomb was not, or that Jesus' body was stolen. And if the body had never been stolen, or these people were saying, there would be no need for a conspiracy theory. But you look, and it's Matthew writing this, it's in verse 12. And this is the conspiracy theory. It says, when the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. Now, very early on the first resurrection Sunday morning, the Jewish leaders had to meet together and they had to come up with this conspiracy theory. And the fact that Matthew notes this conspiracy theory down here is a reminder to us that the tomb really was empty. Because if Jesus had still been lying in that tomb, if the tomb had been left intact, there would have been no need to devise a conspiracy theory. But as you note towards the end of verse 15 that Matthew is able to add further, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. The fact that Matthew is writing that is showing that they were trying to cover something up. And they were only trying to cover something up because the tomb was empty. So we can believe the tomb was empty. And we can also have a confidence in what Matthew is recording himself, that he believes that it was God who raised Jesus from the dead. Because if Matthew is trying to convince you of something, and if he thought his argument was weak, he would not have included other stories. But the fact that Matthew says, look, here's a conspiracy theory, means that he has confidence in his own story. And he says, this stuff that other people are saying is rubbish. That's what they're saying. And the fact that they're having to say that is that you know the tomb was empty. So we can believe today that the tomb really was empty. Another thing that we can believe is that there really were eyewitnesses to the resurrection. And I think the reason that we can believe what the Bible is saying here about the eyewitnesses who saw the resurrection is again by thinking of the society 2,000 years ago and what it was like. And it was pretty much the same as it is today, as that I think it's pretty much safe to believe that the more important people think you are, the more they will listen to you. So the higher up you are, up the corporate ladder or the tree, whatever it is, how you want to describe that, more people will listen to you the higher up you are. Those at the bottom, people don't really listen to. And we hear a lot in our society today about inequality between the genders, and we wonder why it is, if two people are doing the same job, why they might get paid different money, and there's no real reason for that. Why does that happen? Going back 2,000 years ago, it would have been a lot worse, because in Greek society, Roman society, Jewish society, women were not able to own property. And as well as not owning property, when they spoke in a court, no one listened to them because their voice was inadmissible. So keep that in mind. And remembering that Matthew is writing a story that he wants people to believe. And if he was concocting a story out of his own mind, who would he pretend were the first witnesses to the resurrection? If you were writing a story and you wanted people to believe, you would pick up important people, significant people, and says, this person saw what happened. But look how Matthew begins. Verse 1. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb. So he says there were two women. Again, they're the lowest of society in that sense. Their voices aren't even credible in court. Now, if that wasn't true, Matthew wouldn't have written that. If Matthew was inventing a story, he would have tried to think of important people to try and get you to believe a story that wasn't true. But the fact that he mentions two women is showing that this must have been the way that it happened. And then later on, down in verses 8 to 10. So the women hurried away from the tomb. They were afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly, Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. That's twice that Matthew's done this. Twice he's pointing, it's women that Jesus first appeared to. So again, that is a reason that we really can believe this account, because Matthew wouldn't have written about that if it didn't happen in that way. If he was inventing a story, he would have thought about it in a much more creative way. But the fact that this is what it says means me and you that we really can believe this. And the third reason that we can believe this is because we know that the church really impacted the world. At the end of this passage, if you look to verses 19 and 20, and Jesus appearing to his disciples, and what he says to them, he says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Jesus is telling his disciples to go into the world and impact the world. How many disciples were there when Jesus said those words? You're all keeping your heads down. It's like Hebrew class in college. There were 120 disciples at that point. And yet we know, less or about 200 years later, that this little group, impoverished, not important people, just ordinary people, had impacted the whole of civilization so that the emperor became a Christian and that the Roman Empire became known as the Holy Roman Empire, so that the whole of society was impacted by the gospel and by this message of Jesus Christ. And if this wasn't real, and if the people hadn't been so passionate about it, and if they hadn't died for it, then that never would have happened, and people wouldn't have died for something that they knew was false and made up. And so we've got 3 good reasons why I think we know that the early church really believed this. But there's one other little thing I want you to look at, and it's the last 3 words of verse 17. And it describes the disciples coming to meet Jesus. It says, when they saw him, they worshipped him. But look at those last 3 words. But some doubted. Now, why I think that's really important, and this is what people have said to me, and I'm sure people have said the same thing to you. And they'll ask you, how do you know? Has anyone ever come from heaven to tell you that this is true? I've heard that. I'm sure you have heard that. And they'll say something even more, and they'll say, if a friend of mine, someone that I know, if that person dies and they go to heaven, and then they come back and they're standing in front of me, and then they tell me about Jesus in heaven, then I will believe. Now look what Matthew records in verse 17. Here is someone they knew. They watched him die. He's come back. He's standing in front of them. And what does Matthew write? But some doubted. And yet, that's what we constantly hear. That if someone came back, then I would definitely believe. And unless someone who had actually been there, seen that, heard what Jesus had done, had seen Jesus, and still noticed that some people still didn't believe, that some people still doubted, unless you had been there, you wouldn't say that. So again, I think that's another good reason why we can have confidence that this is real and true. So today we meet, and we've got reasons to have confidence in the gospel that we really can believe this. And yet we have an understanding that the resurrection is so vitally important that it changes our whole lives. It's the thing that really changes us. I was saying at the outset, are you an optimist or a pessimist? As you look at your life, how do you see your life working out? What are you hoping for? What are you hoping that comes to pass? And do you have any confidence for the future? Because if your confidence is not in Jesus Christ, you have absolutely no confidence for the future. You will live. You will die. What happens beyond that? And if you want to have a confidence beyond that, your confidence needs to be in Jesus Christ. And yet it's the resurrection that shows that that is real. J.R.R. Tolkien of Lord of the Rings fame has said something like this, and I read this, so I didn't learn the quotation, but basically he was talking about the turn of a story. And he was saying that the mark of a good story, he says, no matter how magical it is, no matter how fantastic it is, no matter how unbelievable it is, he says, for anyone who's hearing that story, when the turn in the story comes, it has such an impact on them that it grips their heart and enlivens them and inspires them. And when we think of the story of the gospel, when we think of what the Bible is writing, when we think even of your own experience, the turn that comes, surely it's the resurrection. It's the resurrection that gives you a confidence for the future, so that even when you're living, and sometimes our experience of life can be a bit nightmarish, and sometimes our experience of living is more like dying, in that it is painful, it is hard, it is difficult, and we endure those things and we have to go through it. And we have so many questions, and there are so many unanswered things that we have to go through. And yet it's the resurrection that is the turn for us. It enables us to see things differently. So if we are wanting to have any degree of optimism for the future, any degree of confidence for the future, it has to be in the resurrection, because it's the only thing that impacts us and changes us. And I trust that even as we're meeting here today, that is what we believe, and that's what we're centered on. Maybe at this point we'll go straight into our next song. Because we do want to celebrate. We do want just to focus and allow the words that we're going to sing just now to resonate as this is the thing that gives me confidence. This is the thing that changes my life. And because of what I understand in the gospel, that I have a hope that heaven is in front of me. And that knowing that heaven is in front of me, and that by the resurrection, and that Jesus standing in a new glorified humanity is the proof and confidence that we will have a new glorified humanity, and that we have been made ready for heaven and standing in front of Jesus in heaven. That's our glorious resurrection hope. So we stand together and we express that, and it's the words of Christ for me.